Hello, I'm James Temperton, digital editor at Wired UK. I'm joined today by Mike Nugent, who's the head of intelligent fleet decarbonisation for the social innovation business in Europe at Hitachi, and Steve Jones, who's the sector lead for transport infrastructure at Hitachi ABB Power Grids. We're here to discuss social innovation and the crucial role it has to play in tackling climate crisis goals. Let's start with some introductions. Mike, if you could give us a little bit more about your role and what you're focused on at the moment.
Yeah, sure, James. Hi. So Mike Nugent. My role is really within the social innovation business within Hitachi to build and develop new businesses, in particular focusing right now on the whole fleet side and how we can bring decarbonisation and net zero solutions to organisations, particularly around light commercial vehicles, buses, big fleets across the UK and Europe.
Good stuff. And Steve, how about you?
Thanks, James. So I'm the sector lead for transport and infrastructure, Hitachi ABB Power Grids. So that encompasses quite a portfolio, really. So we're focusing on rail, we're focusing on land transport, we're also focusing on marine and aviation as well. So we're looking at it as a fully integrated transport and decarbonisation programme. So we're very active at the moment, particularly around depots. And looking at the larger rollouts and the larger implications that will have on the network and on the environment.
So social innovation is a term that's bandied around quite a lot. How does Hitachi define it, and how is it working towards making those changes real?
Sure. So we define it in three key areas: social, environmental, and economic terms. So obviously, we have to make money, so it has to be around the economic element of how we can actually generate real economic value in the society and through the economy. But really critically linked to that is how we actually have a positive impact on society. So that's why decarbonisation and net zero is so important to us. And then, of course, environmentally, we've got to make sure that actually we're delivering something that is there for the long term and actually drives towards the wider societal and economic and environmental values around net zero, decarbonisation, and really generating value across all three of those areas.
And Hitachi is a very, very large company with lots of different moving parts. So how are you partnering with the other parts of Hitachi to work towards these goals of decarbonisation and making a social innovation business profitable and successful?
Yes, it's really about identifying those parts of Hitachi that can really help us in terms of delivering those different solutions. So Hitachi Capital Vehicle Solutions, which can provide the electric vehicles, Hitachi ABB Power Grids with Steve in terms of the depots, and then the work that we do through our consultancy and our digital businesses, which is generating intellectual property and insights around how we can actually deliver these types of solutions through a digital platform. So thinking about how you can string all those three things together, all those different organizations together. So we're thinking about social innovation and solutions and the different component parts of our organization to build new propositions. As you said, Hitachi is a very large organization. And I think large organizations such as ourselves tend to sometimes have a problem when they get so big in terms of how they can generate organic growth, as opposed to acquisitions or just big developments like nuclear power stations, for example. So it's more about how we think about what society is needing, what we are looking to achieve, what are the objectives that society is asking for, linking that to our different businesses, and then building new propositions around what we're trying to achieve, and thinking about how we can really amalgamate those different skills, capabilities, and activities of the Hitachi businesses to generate new areas of value and new opportunities for growth and social innovation.
Talking about new propositions and new opportunities, let's zero in on large fleet organizations and decarbonisation there. How does this way of thinking and working help to simplify that process of decarbonisation for big fleet management companies?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, right now we've got a lot of new objectives around how we've got to convert vehicles from combustion to electric, and that brings up a whole range of questions for a fleet operator that they've not had to think about before. Grid connections, the scale and size of their depots, what type of vehicles should they be choosing, what ranges do they need, what is the business case, what is the economics around this, and how are they actually going to be able to prove that they're delivering social innovation themselves, and how are they going to hit their targets. So there's a huge amount of risk and uncertainty, because essentially if we think 5 years ahead, battery technologies are likely to be very different. Even the objectives are going to be very different. Even in the last year, we've seen how the world has changed so dramatically and different objectives have been set. So we see the role of Hitachi as really simplifying that process, because we understand all of those different elements. We're constantly horizon scanning. We're constantly thinking about what we can do in the future. And we're also building solutions that can help deliver across each of those fundamental elements. So we're looking at turnkey solutions that essentially de-risk the decision-making process for our customers and the fleet owners. We're thinking about what are the challenges that they're facing, whether that be financial, how can they raise the capital, whether that be decisions on vehicles, decisions on routes, decisions on prioritizing which depots to convert, when and how to convert them, and making that process a lot more simple. That's our job, is to take some of that risk away, but then make sure that we can accelerate the process of social innovation and delivering that economic, social, and environmental value as quickly and effectively as possible for everybody.
You hinted a little bit at the pandemic there. The last 12 months, or slightly less than at the time that we're talking, have brought about unprecedented change in a very, very short period of time. So in terms of social innovation businesses, can we come up with new business models to ensure that decarbonisation delivers on those three key aspects: economic, social, and environmental values that we all want to deliver, given the extra pressures put on so many businesses and countries by the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial, because capital is scarce. It's going to become scarcer. It's difficult for, say, a bus operator now to raise finance to deliver these types of solutions in the traditional way: buy a bus, maintain a bus, keep it running, keep it operational. I think we need to be looking at as a service type business models in particular, so that organizations can literally have a certainty of cost on a month by month basis. And then they can work out how they can then effectively deliver their services and get a margin from that business on top of that. It's really incumbent on organizations such as Hitachi to make that really simple, make it really effective, and make it easy for people to engage and to buy and to move forward. I think there are so many barriers, both from a regulatory point of view and from a financial point of view, that face the fleet owner and operator right now. It's really incumbent on people like Steve and myself to really think about how we can effectively help organizations with the right kind of business models, with the right kind of financial opportunities, with the means by which that they can accelerate the progression towards decarbonisation. Essentially, you can't put this in the too hard to do box. We're all being told to do it. We know we've got to do it. The Paris Accord is going to become increasingly important with the new president. It does look like that's going to start moving forward more rapidly, and the United Kingdom's Green Deal and how that's going to start evolving is going to really drive that even quicker. So it's incumbent on us, and it's our responsibility within Hitachi to help and support organizations to deliver on that by giving them the simplest means by which they can transact and deliver those solutions.
So, Steve, if I could turn to you, we've talked about simplifying things. We've talked about the scale of Hitachi as an organization, and we've talked about the scale of the problem that we all face in the climate crisis. So what role is Hitachi ABB Power Grids playing in this ongoing work?
Well, I think if you look at Hitachi ABB Power Grids, decades of experience really in the energy sector, from transmission, distribution, and transport is a key play in our business model. I think one of the things that COVID has made clear to everyone is now we can actually see the impact of bad air quality and greenhouse gases. We've seen pictures of before and after cities back last summer, and with transport impacting something like 30% of greenhouse gases in the UK, it's a key driver for us. And we're very, very keen to enable the clients that we deal with to optimize that and to move that forward as quick as we can. Now, Mike touched on the fact that we look at, first of all, grid connection and grid restraints, because this is a major player in enabling depots and the decarbonisation of transport is having that energy available to carry that out. And also what kind of fleet are we trying to electrify, and what is the end game? We've done the few trials, we've done the few buses, but now we see the requirement for larger rollouts, and how do we optimize that? And also, how do we charge these vehicles from electrification perspective? And what type of charging do we need, and what's optimized for the client? Not just for charging his vehicles, but also for his process. We see a lot of activity in depots, very, very different world from having diesel depots to having electrification in that depot. And they're trying to manage that world today, and they're trying to move forward, and having that partner that we sort of brought to them from an Hitachi and from a Power Grids perspective is really playing a great part in that space.
So let's focus on those infrastructure challenges. You mentioned that managing a depot on electric vehicles versus a depot on diesel vehicles is a hugely different undertaking. So what are the core infrastructure challenges that we need to overcome if we're to decarbonize these huge fleets of commercial vehicles?
Well, the grid is obviously plays a key part in that. So the energy that we can receive from the grid, not just now, but what is going to be capable in the next 2, 3 or 5 years' time. And that is a key play here. So we have to optimize what they have now. And the digitalisation space is really enabling us to provide innovative ways to do that by balancing the network, optimizing the current assets that they have, and trying to manage the network as it is. And also looking in the future, what will be a new electrification depot? Will it be connected at distribution level? Or will it need to be connected at transmission level, because of the power requirements? And indeed, will that energy that's providing that service be clean? So is it renewables? So there's all those aspects that I think need to come into play there. So the digitalisation piece, as I mentioned, and other assets that we can deploy, things like energy storage, which plays a key part and will play a more active part in some of these larger rollouts where they can have capability of peak shaving. They can have the aspect of charging off peak when electricity is cheap, and using that asset to do that and help that decarbonisation program.
You mentioned digitalisation. Data must play a really, really key role in all of this. Fleet managers have got to really understand how their network is operating and how best to optimize it. So how important is data for moving from petrol and diesel to fully electric fleets, both commercially and in terms of the general public going about their day-to-day lives?
I think it's key, really. If we look at the digitalisation piece now, not just inside the depot, but also outside of the depot. Now, it's not a case of just pouring down data that's coming in real time. It's about using that data intelligently, en route data, looking at the analysis that, the way the buses are being driven, the way the buses are charged, the degradation of that bus. Is it still capable of carrying out that route? Looking at driver behaviour. There's a whole range of functionality that comes in from that. And then if you look at the artificial intelligence or AI in that scape, we've been able to predict the future. We've been able to predictive maintenance, predictive on the way the buses are driven, their life cycle. And there's a whole range of things that will come out of that digitalisation, which we haven't seen yet. So it's a step change from having a lot of assets, a lot of physical assets, to using the data and making it a lot more intelligent than it is at the moment.
And Mike, the data that may have been collected in the past over the last several months has changed completely and will continue to change as we go about working out what a new normal looks like as we move into 2021. So to take one example, a demand-led, digital-led transport network, how does that fit into a post-COVID world, whatever that ends up being?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I think if we sort of said to people sort of 10, 15 years ago, would you expect to have pretty well anything delivered to your house within 24 hours after you clicked a few buttons on your computer? They call you crazy. And now we get upset when our Amazon delivery doesn't arrive exactly at the time that they said. So I think the expectations around how transport fits into our daily lives are going to change. I think COVID has played a really interesting role in terms of showing how quickly we can actually change. I mean, people have been talking about home working for years. Recognise clearly it's certainly a white collar perspective on the world, but actually it is changing the way that we view our urban and our suburban and our city lifestyles, and the way that we interact societally and from a workplace perspective. So I think, and then when we then layer on top of that things like autonomous driving and vehicles that you maybe tap a few buttons and a vehicle arrives at your door and takes you to the train station, it's not perhaps as sort of so far in the future space age that it's something that we think is not going to happen so quickly now, and we see these big shocks as almost accelerating those. So I think the expectation of the traveller is going to be a lot higher in terms of that seamless, integrated means by which they travel from one place to another using different modes. So I do see sort of demand-led, more reactive-based public and private transport as becoming an increasingly important part of that. But in addition to that, then the post-COVID world then layers on, but what exactly does that look like? We've now, if you just take the simple example of buses right now, they're all currently regulated as an example for, let's say, a bus needs to be in place every 10 minutes on its route. So you've only got a maximum wait time of 10 minutes in the off-peak period. But the bus operators are having to do that, but the buses are empty. They're not getting the same levels of utilization that they had, 10 months ago. So we've got to look at this in a much more sort of integrated transport strategy, regulatory and utilization perspective, as well as link it into almost town planning and the way that our city centres and our urban centres are now going to be used, and the way that we interact with them. So I think it plays a huge role. I think the data then becomes fundamental, because it's about how you both manage and then track and improve the way that transport is delivered across those different modes.
The inherent flexibility of cars and buses means that, it's a challenge to rethink this for that area, but rail is by its very nature a lot more fixed. So how do we fit all that together and make sure that rail isn't forgotten as we go through this really rapid period of transition?
This is more Steve's area, but because I think it's really about sort of, it's almost like that. It's the power link, isn't it, really, Steve? I think that's where it really comes to play.
Yeah. We, as I mentioned earlier, rail is a big aspect of our business, and it has been for a long time. And we've been working with Hitachi Rail before the JV, so it's a crucial part of our business. And there's a lot of activity in rail around electrification, new routes and so on. But in reality, there's probably around 38% of that rail network is electrified. So there's still a lot of work to do in that space. And electrification of routes is also being looked at. We're working on several opportunities and projects there now. But it's not just all about electricity. We may be looking at other sources. Hydrogen, for example, is another fuel that will fit very well into the rail network for various routes. So that whole ecosystem of rail is also being looked at. How do we optimize that, and how do we have this combined journey, and optimize that from a utilization piece of view. I always think of it as my sat nav or my Google nav. If there's a traffic jam, it reroutes me. But that's just me in my car. So it would be great to have something that could actually act like that, but look at the whole route that I'm taking, whether it's multimodal, and work in that space. So I think that's where digitalisation will play a big part in the future.
It's a really good point. I think we've all been in situations where we're on one mode of transport and we're relying on it to get us to another mode of transport, or we've got quite a complex itinerary. And even though maybe all the data is there, it isn't connected in an intelligent enough way to be able to give us good answers. So as far as rail is concerned, as well as the unique challenges it poses, it also has potentially some really exciting new ways that it can go with hydrogen and with a greater adoption of smart artificial intelligence, potentially powered data, to turn it from something that is quite fixed and unflexible into something that is more flexible in this more demand-led mobility plan.
No, agreed. And I suppose the interesting thing about what the things like Steve and I are doing is we kind of see these as almost like pillar propositions. You know, we recognise that this is part of a much greater whole of what we're trying to achieve, because the future really is one of much more integration, both from a utilisation and from a management point of view, across these different modes of transport and energy. And it's really important to bring energy and sort of intelligent infrastructure and vehicle usage and vehicle management all under one roof, in terms of the way that actually we look at our cities and the way that we actually manage the future of our city. So, you know, while we're focusing on specific objectives around, you know, electrification of depots and the conversion of vehicle fleets, it's not a single sum game. It's part. Those are just complementary parts of a wider perspective from Hitachi about how we view the evolution of cities and the way that we interact in our cities. And things like COVID really kind of is a massive shock to that, because, you know, all the norms this time last year are completely different today, and we've got to recognise that that's going to continue to change as time goes on. Clearly, there's a wider trend globally around sort of the urbanisation of the human population. But maybe that's going to change a little bit. Maybe people are going to interact in a slightly different way. And you know, in our little microcosm in the United Kingdom, you've got city centres that are basically really being impacted both by COVID, but before COVID, the whole move towards sort of more online shopping. So what do we do with those spaces? And actually, does the WeWork model become more fundamental for the way that people want to work and interact? And our job is to keep on thinking about those things and the way that all of those different modes of transport interact, how they're going to be utilised, whether, you know, the traditional way that we run our trains, our buses, and the way that we use our private vehicles is going to fundamentally change. And we've got to keep a really close eye on that, because, you know, as we've learned over the last 12 months, things can change very quickly.
Yeah, and that I think we're all very aware of how quickly change can happen. The last 10 or so months has made us acutely aware that everything can change almost on a monthly basis. And Steve, I wonder, in the business of change, but also the business of big, complicated infrastructure projects, how much flexibility can you build into that physical network of stuff to make sure that it is able to respond to those changes, even if you don't know what those changes are going to be, because they're yet to happen?
Yeah, I think I've time in grid edge technologies, my previous role, and this was a key part really, and it was called grid edge for a reason, because we still need the grid, but the flexibility that's being produced, what we call behind the meter, is considerable. Now, whether it's in the C&I market or whether it's in other areas, then the flexibility that distributed energy is giving people has given them different options, you know, whether it's the local energy markets or whether it's the flexibility they need to reduce energy costs or even reduce energy, unproduced energy from clean sources. So the whole ecosystem of grid edge solutions and generation, particularly around cities and when we talk about smart cities, has a huge part to play there. And of course, we still need the grid, but we need a clean grid. And the grid needs to support that. And I think what we're finding, the complementary part of that, is that distributed energy now is providing services back to the grid. So they're providing flexibility into the network, which prevents more cables going into the ground and more pylons going up in the fields. Now, so ultimately, there's a partnership there between the grid and the distributed energy. And what we'll see in the near future, we see this in some countries already, is microgrids. Now, so this gives you the capability to go offline at peak times in the grid, you know, and that is a big part in some countries. And we see it now in the UK becoming more and more apparent.
What are the benefits of microgrids, and how do they fit into this maybe new definition that we have of cities, or this evolving definition we have of cities that Mike was talking about?
I think the benefit of the microgrid is, as I mentioned, it gives you the flexibility and gives you the capability to remove yourself from the grid. So it gives new tools to the transmission and distribution operators. I think also we're seeing an increase in what is termed local energy markets. So this gives people the option to trade energy between themselves. So if you're generating energy, you can sell that and you can buy that inside the local energy markets. And it becomes self-sufficient. So it's becoming a real big interesting area with things such as blockchain and digital technologies, which is allowing this to happen. So if you look at some of the countries, Australia, microgrids are quite common there for the very reason that they have very seasonal loads and demands. We see it in the US because of the vastness and the number of TSOs and distribution network operators that they have. But we're also starting to see that now in Western Europe, the clear way forward for smart cities.
And the traditional view of the city, Mike, you touched on it a little earlier, maybe the rise of co-working spaces, although they've had their financial struggles in recent years for sure, the hollowing out of the high street by major online retailers. So is our traditional view of the city dead? And if it is, how do we utilize those very densely packed urban spaces that we used to spend so much time in, but also the suburban spaces that we're all now spending a lot more time in and maybe discovering don't have the utilities and the facilities that we'd like?
Yeah, I think the caution here is we need to not get overexcited about this big shock and the way and our working lives are going to change forever. I think for a lot of people it hasn't changed at all. They still need to go to their workplace. They still need to, if they work in a factory or if they're providing services that are more locally provided. But I do think that it's raising some questions for sure about some of almost if you took a step back and you said, how logical is it for hundreds of thousands of people to commute in on a daily basis to then work in an office, not really talk to many people, go and grab a sandwich, then get back to your desk and then work a few more hours and then go back. There's a lot of people that for good or for worse, they're feeling overworked or more productive depending on their viewpoints under the Teams-based Zoom economy as we now have right now in sort of our current circumstances. But I think more interestingly is then how some of these things actually stick. And to what extent it sticks, and people then start thinking about and new innovations in workplace and activities and the way that we live our working and our non-working lives, and therefore how we interact. There's been quite a lot of evidence to say that a lot of people have moved out of cities, and even some younger people who would put up with a small flat in a city because of the social life that gives them in their 20s. They're now looking at it and thinking this is pretty rubbish if I'm locked in all the time. So I do think it's raising some interesting questions. It's difficult to say exactly how we'll all react once this is all over, and whether people will start thinking about doing things in a different way. I think it will be led by some of the corporations that say actually this is how we make a decision on the way that we want to work. So I think it's kind of it's as with all things, change is there's a lot of inertia. It'll be interesting to see how we bounce back and the way that people react. It could go completely the other way, and everybody says, "Thank God I'm out of the home for a few hours, and I want to move back to how it all was." So I think it's dangerous to be overly excited one way or the other. I think it will change for some people. It'll have no change for others. But I think we all know that the COVID crisis has changed our mentalities a lot about a lot of things, and I think that's going to play out over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, alongside the technology, alongside the innovations that we're looking to bring to the market, alongside the regulations and the way that the regulatory environment changes. Those will be the things that really have the more longer term impact, I think.
So regulation is something I want to come on to in just a moment. But if I can pick up on one aspect of your answer there. Social isolation is something that a lot of people have felt as a result of lockdown, but also as a result of continued remote working. And we've seen large companies, the likes of Facebook and Google and Twitter, saying to their employees that they can potentially work from home, wherever home may be, indefinitely. So what role can social innovation projects play in ensuring that we're not more socially isolated as a result of either a new normal or an aspect of a new normal?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it is. I touched on kind of obviously we work model financially, maybe too early, too soon, but sort of those more utilizing those spaces in our urban and suburban environments that are maybe been left adrift as a result of the wider social changes that we're going through. Those could easily be more utilized. I think as we're all discovering ultimately. We are social animals. We crave that interaction, and I think that where it starts getting really interesting is then if you've got people working not in the same company but working together. That's where real innovation starts to happen. It's how how humans interact and how different and new ideas get sparked by just somebody talking about something completely unrelated. But we have an innate ability to see patterns and to look at things in a different way and go, oh, I wonder if we could do that in our industry, or we could do things in a different way. So I see sort of the social innovation role for companies like ourselves is actually, how do we foster innovation? How do we foster enhanced ways of working, enhanced solutions, and to the betterment of society, the environment, and the economy, the betterment of us all? How do we grow as a society through different ways of interacting? And I think there's a real opportunity that's been thrust upon us as a result of COVID that we need to be looking at and thinking about, well, how can we foster that? How can we harness that human interaction and new ideas to develop new solutions?
It's a huge challenge, but I think you're right to say that there's an opportunity to develop some hopefully exciting new solutions. Steve, if I could turn to you on the regulation question. So a lot of what we're talking about here, these are huge social and urban planning challenges. And as Mike said, the biggest driver of that change potentially is going to be regulation. It's necessary that regulation has to change in order to unlock some of these future benefits. So where does that policy come from? And what does that policy need to look like for the sort of change that you're talking about in the areas that you're focused on?
I think, to start with, I think from the distribution network and the regulation that they've had for many years, we have seen some step changes in some of their, what they call RIIO2, some of their funding programs, which is now evidently focusing on EV and electrification requirements. So that's quite new, and that's an area which is key. And we see a lot of the distribution network operators now working in that space for EV rollouts and working with a lot of partners as well outside of that area. So I think the regulation from around the distribution network operators' perspective, it's good. It's moving in the right direction, but we still need to think, as we mentioned earlier, things like grid connections. It's the two barriers there is cost and time. So we need to address that really. So it'd be great if the regulation could look at how we can speed that process up for processes, and connections are already in their agreement, but there is a time to do that, and recognizing that some of these areas are going to need these upgrades quite quickly if we're going to carry on with the decarbonisation at the speed we would like and the speed we're seeing in some areas as well. I think from a distributed energy perspective, the targeted charge review, which has just been released, is good. It's now some clarification on the increase in distributed energy, which will also play quite a key part in this space too.
And I think Mike, the same question to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's some other aspects as well for me in terms of even at a sort of a relatively micro level for a fleet owner and operator with depots spread across the country. I think they need some consistency in terms of the regulations, because if you're evaluating the total cost of ownership comparison between a carbon engine and an electric engine, it's incredibly difficult if you're looking at different ULEZ, ultra low emission zones or congestion charging or different car parking charges or any other local charging networks or frameworks from a regulatory point of view, it's really difficult for them to then look at their fleet in the whole. They've got to literally go down to the micro level, which slows things down, right? So we need to be thinking about that. I think also, you look at some of the other countries, like in China, they look at massively disincentivizing carbon-based engines by charging for the number plate for a carbon vehicle, for example, and no charge. Or in the Nordics, you've then got no VAT on vehicles. I think we need to see the right kind of balance between carrot and stick to help us get to the targets. And if the target comes down to 2030, it's not just a case of here's a target and that's it. You've got to try and provide some kind of incentive structure as well as disincentive structure. We've all got this public good, the air that we breathe. We want to try and discourage the demerit goods, the carbon-based engines. You want to encourage the merit goods, the electric or the hydrogen goods. It's so important that we get the right mix and we get the consistency. And I suppose if I've got one big ask, it is for government to get a more integrated strategy across the Green Deal, across the transport side of things, across the infrastructure piece, to really think about, well, how do all of these things, and energy and the energy strategy, how do all these things actually fit together? And how does the regulatory structure fit together, both from a disincentive perspective and from the right kind of incentives? That's got to be, we've got to get the right kind of balance and be focused on all of those objectives together. It's not easy. If it was easy, it would have been done already, right? But the point is we've got to find a way to deliver on that. Hitachi wants to do its part. We want to provide the cheap finance. We want to provide the right solutions. We want to get the right kind of de-risk it for the decision makers as much as we can within that environment. But give us an easier environment to work in. It makes it easier for everybody, and it'll accelerate the means by which we can shift from a carbon-based economy to a non-carbon-based economy.
Absolutely. I mean, these are huge challenges for all of us, and it's easy to lose sight of them amongst all of the change that we've gone through in 2020. But when things do settle down, it will be the climate crisis that we all face together and need to come up with clever solutions to help us move to a more sustainable future. Mike, Steve, thanks so much for your time today, and thanks to you for watching. Take care. Goodbye.